Don't break an empath. Most people hear that sentence and imagine weakness. They picture someone who gives too much, forgives too often, and carries the emotions of everyone around them like an invisible burden. They see kindness and mistake it for fragility. They see patience and mistake it for surrender. They see compassion and mistake it for a lack of power. That is where the mistake begins. The most dangerous misunderstanding in human behavior is assuming that a calm person has no limits. Human beings are experts at measuring visible strength. We notice the loud voice, the aggressive posture, the public display of confidence. But we often fail to recognize the deeper forms of strength because they don't announce themselves. They don't need to. An empath spends years studying people without realizing they're studying them. They notice changes in tone. They notice what wasn't said. They notice the pause before the answer. They notice the smile that doesn't reach the eyes. They notice the tension behind the joke. They gather information constantly because they feel it. While others are focused on appearances, the empath is focused on patterns, and patterns reveal truth. The strange thing about highly empathetic people is that they often become experts in human nature long before they ever think of themselves that way. Every room becomes a classroom. Every conversation becomes a lesson. Every disappointment becomes data. When you hurt someone who leads with ego, they usually react immediately. The response is obvious. The conflict is visible. The battle begins at once. When you hurt an empath, something different happens. At first, they try to understand. They replay the situation. They search for explanations. They give second chances where others would walk away. They create reasons for behavior that should never have happened. They extend grace. They offer understanding. They carry responsibility that doesn't belong to them. This is why people often take them for granted. The empath's greatest strength becomes their greatest vulnerability. Their ability to understand people can become an excuse for tolerating what should never be tolerated. Their compassion can become a bridge that allows others to keep crossing boundaries. But every human being has a threshold. Every human being reaches a point where understanding no longer outweighs reality. And when an empath reaches that point, something changes, not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. The questions stop. The explanations stop. The negotiations stop. The energy that once flowed endlessly toward fixing the relationship begins flowing inward. That is the moment most people never see coming because they expected a fight. Instead, they get clarity. They expected an emotional explosion. Instead, they get emotional detachment. And detachment is far more powerful than anger. Anger still cares. Anger still hopes. Anger still wants a different outcome. Detachment has already accepted reality. The empath who has finally seen the truth no longer wastes energy arguing with it. That is what people regret. Not the yelling that never happened. Not the revenge that never came. The regret comes from realizing that the person who once understood them better than anyone else no longer feels obligated to carry them. The door doesn't slam. It simply closes. The attention disappears. The emotional labor disappears. The endless patience disappears. The benefit of the doubt disappears. And suddenly, the people who took those things for granted discover how valuable they were. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it is not fueled by hatred. Hatred keeps people connected. Hatred demands energy. Hatred creates obsession. The empath's final stage is often something much more unsettling. Acceptance. Acceptance means seeing someone exactly as they are without trying to rescue them from their own choices. Acceptance means recognizing that not everyone wants growth. Not everyone wants honesty. Not everyone wants accountability, and not everyone deserves unlimited access to your compassion. This realization changes everything. The empath stops asking, "How can I help this person become better?" and starts asking, "Why am I sacrificing myself for someone who has no intention of changing?" That single question can transform an entire life, because boundaries are not walls. Boundaries are revelations. They reveal who respects you. They reveal who only valued your usefulness. They reveal who celebrated your kindness while exploiting it. The moment boundaries appear, masks begin to fall. People who genuinely care about you adapt. People who benefited from your lack of boundaries resist. And resistance tells a story words never could. Many people fear the anger of strong individuals. Few understand the significance of losing access to a good one. A broken empath does not become cruel. A broken empath becomes selective. They learn that attention is valuable, trust is valuable, presence is valuable, time is valuable. And once they learn the value of these things, they stop giving them away to those who never appreciated them. That is why the aftermath surprises people. The empath is no longer trying to win, no longer trying to convince, no longer trying to prove, no longer trying to save. Instead, they are building peace, building standards, building a life that no longer depends on the approval of those who failed to respect them. And while others are still replaying old games, the empath has already moved beyond them. The greatest mistake someone can make is assuming that kindness exists because there is no alternative. Kindness is often a choice made by people who understand pain better than anyone else. Compassion is often practiced by those who know exactly how much damage human beings can cause. Patience is often exercised by people capable of far more than they reveal. The strongest people in the room are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones who have every reason to become bitter and choose wisdom instead. Every act of empathy requires strength. Every act of forgiveness requires strength. Every act of understanding requires strength. But strength should never be confused with permission. The empath's lesson is not that everyone deserves endless chances. The lesson is that self-respect must exist alongside compassion. Without self-respect, empathy becomes self-destruction. With self-respect, empathy becomes one of the most powerful forces a human being can possess. So don't break an empath. Don't mistake patience for weakness. Don't mistake understanding for submission. Don't mistake kindness for dependence, because the moment an empath finally sees the complete picture, they stop fighting reality. And when that happens, they don't become your enemy. They become something far more difficult to influence. Someone who no longer needs your validation. Someone who no longer fears your absence. Someone who has finally remembered their worth. And once a person reaches that point, there is very little in this world that can stop them. The moment an empath remembers their worth, a silent shift takes place that most people never recognize until it is far too late. There is no announcement, no declaration. No dramatic speech delivered across a crowded room. Human beings expect major changes to arrive with noise. Real transformation rarely does. Real transformation often arrives in silence. The empath begins observing differently. For years, they may have looked at people through the lens of potential. They saw who someone could become. They saw hidden strengths. They saw buried wounds. They saw possibilities that others overlooked. This ability is beautiful, but it carries a hidden danger. When you focus too heavily on potential, you can lose sight of reality. Reality is not who someone promises to become. Reality is who they consistently choose to be. That distinction changes everything. Many empaths spend years investing emotional energy into future versions of people that never arrive. They become loyal to promises instead of patterns. They become attached to possibilities instead of evidence. They wait for change that never materializes. Then one day, the fog lifts, not because they stop caring, because they start seeing. And seeing clearly is one of the most powerful experiences a human being can have. Once clarity arrives, excuses begin losing their power. The stories that once justified bad behavior begin sounding hollow. The explanations that once created confusion begin revealing contradictions. The empath starts noticing something they previously ignored. Consistencies. Human behavior is built on consistency. People tell you who they are repeatedly. Not through speeches, through choices. Not through intentions, through actions. Not through promises, through patterns. Parts are difficult to fake over time. Anyone can perform for a day. Anyone can wear a mask for a week. Anyone can create an image for a month. But eventually, patterns emerge. Patterns reveal priorities. Patterns reveal character. Patterns reveal truth. And once an empath begins paying attention to patterns instead of promises, they become extraordinarily difficult to deceive. This is where many relationships begin to change, not because the empath becomes harsh, not because they become cold, because they become accurate. Accuracy can feel threatening to people who depend on illusion. Think about that. A person living honestly has nothing to fear from clarity. A person living behind masks fears it constantly. The empath who has awakened to their own value becomes less interested in stories and more interested in evidence. They stop evaluating people based on what they say they feel. They begin evaluating people based on what they repeatedly do. This creates a fascinating effect. People who once felt comfortable manipulating them suddenly find their usual tactics failing. Guilt no longer works the same way. Pressure no longer works the same way. Emotional games no longer work the same way. Why? Because manipulation depends on confusion. Clarity destroys confusion. And clarity is the natural enemy of manipulation. The empath begins noticing every attempt to redirect responsibility, every attempt to avoid accountability, every attempt to make them feel responsible for someone else's choices. What once felt convincing now feels transparent. What once felt complicated now feels obvious. What once felt emotionally overwhelming now feels predictable. The game hasn't changed, the empath has. That is why the reaction from others can be so intense. Many people claim they want honesty. What they actually want is agreement. There is a difference. Agreement validates, honesty reveals, and revelation can be uncomfortable, especially when someone has benefited from your self-doubt. One of the most overlooked truths in human behavior is that some people quietly profit from your lack of confidence. They profit from your uncertainty. They profit from your hesitation. They profit from your tendency to question yourself. The moment you stop questioning your value, the arrangement changes, the balance shifts, the leverage disappears. Suddenly, the person who always expected access no longer has it. The person who always expected forgiveness no longer receives it automatically. The person who always expected understanding now encounters boundaries. And boundaries expose intentions. Healthy people respect boundaries. Unhealthy people resent them. That simple observation can save years of unnecessary suffering. Watch what happens when you say no. Watch what happens when you establish limits. Watch what happens when you refuse to abandon your own needs. The response often reveals more than months of conversation ever could, because boundaries are tests of character. Not your character, theirs. People reveal themselves most clearly when they don't get what they want. Anyone can appear supportive when circumstances favor them. Anyone can appear generous when there is no cost. Anyone can appear loyal when loyalty requires nothing. Character becomes visible under pressure. Character becomes visible during disappointment. Character becomes visible when expectations collide with reality. The empath who finally understands this begins navigating life differently, not fearfully, wisely. Wisdom is not suspicion. Wisdom is pattern recognition. There is a difference. Suspicion assumes everyone is dangerous. Wisdom observes who consistently demonstrates trustworthiness. Suspicion isolates. Wisdom evaluates. Suspicion creates fear. Wisdom creates discernment. Discernment becomes one of the empath's greatest strengths. For years, they may have focused on understanding everyone else while neglecting themselves. They became experts in reading emotions, but beginners in protecting their own energy. Now the balance changes. The empath begins asking new questions. Does this relationship create peace or chaos? Does this conversation create growth or confusion? Does this connection require authenticity or performance? Does this person respect boundaries or challenge them? These questions seem simple, yet they have the power to transform an entire life. Most people spend years trying to manage relationships that should have ended long ago. Not because they are weak, because they are hopeful. Hope is beautiful, but hope without evidence can become a prison. There comes a moment when wisdom must guide what hope once carried. There comes a moment when reality must become more important than fantasies. There comes a moment when acceptance must replace endless justification. That moment is painful, but it is also liberating, because every illusion requires energy to maintain. Every false narrative requires emotional investment. Every unhealthy attachment requires constant effort. When the empath releases the illusion, they recover that energy. And recovered energy is powerful. Imagine spending years carrying weight you never realized you were carrying, then one day setting it down. The relief is immediate. The freedom is undeniable. The possibilities become visible. This is why people are often shocked by what happens after an empath walks away. They expect collapse. Instead, they witness growth. They expect bitterness. Instead, they witness peace. They expect obsession. Instead, they witness progress. The reason is simple. The empath was never weak. They were exhausted. There is a difference. A person who has been carrying the emotional responsibilities of multiple people often appears tired. They often appear uncertain. They often appear overwhelmed. Remove the unnecessary burden, and a different person emerges. A stronger person, a clearer person, a more focused person, a more powerful person. Not because they gained something new, because they stopped losing energy to what was draining them. Energy is one of the most valuable resources a human being possesses. Where energy goes, life follows. If your energy constantly flows toward conflict, conflict grows. If your energy constantly flows toward anxiety, anxiety grows. If your energy constantly flows toward people who take more than they give, exhaustion grows. But when energy begins flowing toward purpose, growth becomes inevitable. The empath discovers this firsthand. The time once spent overthinking becomes time spent building. The emotional labor once spent fixing others becomes emotional investment in personal development. The attention once given to toxic cycles becomes attention given to meaningful goals. This is when the transformation accelerates. Confidence begins returning, not performative confidence, not arrogance, real confidence, the kind that comes from experience, the kind that comes from surviving disappointment, the kind that comes from facing reality and remaining standing. Real confidence is quiet. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't require applause. It simply exists, and people notice it. Even if they cannot explain it, there is something unmistakable about a person who no longer negotiates their worth. Their posture changes, their decisions change, their standards change, their relationships change. Their future changes because every major change in life begins with a change in what you are willing to tolerate. Think about that carefully. Every breakthrough begins where tolerance ends. Every transformation begins when acceptance of unhealthy patterns ends.